Welcome to the Peace Building Podcast. Join host Susan Coleman as she interviews today's most creative, courageous, and sometimes outrageous mediators, coaches, entrepreneurs, and out-of-the-box thinkers whose work, whether intended or not, is building peace. Tune in for 45 minutes of pure inspiration as we explore the best stories, the best practices, the best ideas of a new world emerging. Here's your host, global consultant, coach, facilitator, and mediator, Susan Coleman. All right, everybody. I have Aldo Civico here with me, and we've been trying for a long time to get together in person to say hello to each other, but now we couldn't do that, but now we have been able to do this on this podcast. So it's really a pleasure to have him. He's so many things. He's an anti-terrorism leader, a peace builder, an anthropologist dedicated to conflict resolution, an author, and Senator George Mitchell, who, for those of you in the United States, I'm sure you know him. Others may not. He's the U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East, has called Aldo one of the most innovative leaders in the field of conflict resolution. And so in my usual style, I'm not going to go into a ton about your background, Aldo, because I'm going to put it on the website with the podcast. But before I do want to read a little bit of your bio. So maybe first I'll just get your voice in the room and say hello. I haven't given you
Susan. To you and everybody listening to us. Thank you for having me. So.
And I want you to know, you can't see him, but Aldo has on this beautiful shawl. From where is that?
I think it's from, it looks like from Latin America or something, but it's actually from IKEA.
Oh, no.
It has wonderful colors, and it's a little bit cold here today in New York, so I just put it on.
Yeah, no, it's really beautiful, and it totally looks like you got it, in Colombia.
From my field work or what?
Right.
Just around the corner from IKEA.
You should just say that it came from the field work. Don't say it came from IKEA. Okay, I want to I do love the beginning of Aldo's, his whole bio is totally interesting, and I recommend you go and read it and take it fully in, but I'm going to just read you a little bit. In the late summer of 2003, in a high-security prison of Colombia, Aldo Civico met with a top leader of the National Liberation Army, guerrilla. That first conversation turned into a series of encounters that eventually brought Aldo to become a facilitator of ceasefire negotiations between the Colombian government and the guerrilla. Shuttling between Colombia, Cuba, Washington, D.C., Aldo used a variety of sophisticated skills in order to perform under incredible stress, to build trust with extremely difficult people, and to understand the model of the world of his interlocutors. A powerful storyteller, Aldo enchants audiences from beginning to end as he shares the inspiring experiences as a catalyst for change from Colombia to Mexico, from Syria to Haiti, from Italy to the United States. Drawing from his work in the field, Aldo inspires people to become outstanding leaders by building rapport and reframing conflict as an opportunity for personal and organizational growth. His message of stop arguing over who is right and instead explore each other's story exemplifies his approach and the philosophy top mediators use to resolve the toughest problems. So I will just say also that I had Zach Metz on here a little while ago, and I said to Zach, you were the first person that I saw putting peacebuilder on your business card. Now, you might have had that on yours before, Zach, but I remember you being the second person that was just putting yourself out there as somebody who described themselves as a peacebuilder, and it was very inspiring to me. So I don't know if you want to add anything at the outset. I mean, I know one of the things I really want to cover with you. I'd like to hear more, and I'll get to these questions one at a time, but I'd like to hear more about what planted the seeds in you to do this work.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear a story. I think I told you that in our pre-interview, and I don't know what story you're going to tell, but you got so many of them, and you're a storyteller. So, And then I was hoping, if time allows us, I know you put a lot of weight on the individual development all the way to the global negotiations, and I thought it'd be interesting to hear a little bit about that from you as well.
Sure. Yeah, as you were asking me the question, who put the seed, or somehow when that happened, just a story came to mind where I made a discovery about my own life, and that actually was a few years ago. I believe it was 2007, when I was involved in the facilitating the ceasefire negotiations between the government of Colombia and the ELN insurgency in Colombia, which is the second largest insurgent group in Colombia, and so I got to go to
after the FARC is
the FARC, the FARC, and the ELN is in pre-talks right now, so we are hoping that they make the step necessary to actually embrace peace finally after years of armed struggle. But so it was in July. It was an attempt to reach a ceasefire agreement with them, and so at one point I was invited by the head negotiator of the ELN to come to Cuba and have a conversation. So I went there in Cuba, and we were in this house that the Cuban government had given to them for the negotiations with the government. And as we were talking and really somehow exploring each other's stories, we were just getting to know each other. At one point, Pablo Beltran was his name. He was chief negotiator of the ELN. Told me, a few years ago, I took a trip to Germany, and when I was in Germany, I saw that there were the monuments and the paintings in all these democratic institutions in Germany, remembering the freedom fighters against Hitler in Germany. They were celebrating the people who were liberating their country from Hitler. And that struck me because, and he said he identified so much with that struggle, right? And that struck me because suddenly I realized that my grandfather, who was Austrian, was, in today's term, he would be seen as a terrorist and as a member of a guerrilla group, because my grandfather, Hubert, in Innsbruck, when he saw Hitler taking over Austria, he actually organized a group of friends who armed themselves and went into the mountains in a very strategic and large valley near Innsbruck, and over going through a lot of threats and a lot of danger for himself and the family, including my mother. They liberated, right, this valley from the presence of the SS and gave it over to the Americans when the Americans came in, right? But I had never thought of, I never got to know personally my grandfather, right? But I never thought of him as a member of a guerrilla group, as a guerrilla leader, since he was really the leader of this group. And that brought me a curiosity to understand better the history of my grandfather, because my grandfather was always this heroic figure, this mythic figure in our family. Stories were going around,
and what was said about him?
It was, it was mainly the fact that to embrace this value of freedom, and he was a Catholic. He was a union member. He was a conductor in an engineer, engine conducting in the trains, and he left everything, and joined the struggle against Hitler, right?
Can you remember how old you were when you first heard this story? When your first memory of you taking in the thought about your grandfather?
I think I was in kindergarten. I must have been around 3 or 4 years ago, and 3 or years old. And
3 or 4 years ago.
I wish that was Freudian somehow. A child, but it was certainly in the kitchen of my grandmother in Innsbruck, and I must have be 4 or 5 years old the most, as I was listening to the story, really not understanding what World War II was and all of that. But certainly, the idea that I always had about my grandfather was about this figure who lived for something bigger than himself, for that he sacrificed and he put his own life in the line, and that of his family really as well, because they were, of course, persecuted and they had to go into hiding. And that always
they weren't Jewish. They were
no. He was Catholic and
you said he was Catholic, Austrian, just Austrian, and because he was resisting,
exactly right. Mm-hmm. So it was this moment where really these heroic people, regardless of faith tradition, they were just fighting for democracy and liberating their country from a nightmare. And so when that guerrilla leader said that, first of all, it was very useful for our conversation at that moment because I could connect with him. I could understand his model of the world, right? And I could tell him the story of my grandfather, and so that bond us, right? But when I came back to Europe the following summer, I really had the desire for the first time in my life, actually, to go and see the places where my grandfather fought. So if you ask me, where are the seeds, I think they are in the values of my family, starting with that tradition of my grandfather, and that then my parents continued, right? So I grew up at a peaceful time in Italy and Europe.
Where'd you grow up in Italy?
I grew up in northern Italy, correct. Okay. I'm probably, we are the first generation that never had really war in our land, in Italy. So very lucky generation in that sense. But we had other kinds of problems, right? We had the terrorism in the 70s. We had the mafia struggle. And then I had my family who lived these values of having open doors for whoever needed us. And we were not absolutely wealthy. We were a, middle class family, both my parents working. But this idea of being there for others, right? And I remember we were hosting people at our home that needed shelter, sometimes for weeks, months. And I remember a refugee from the Lebanon wars in the 80s came and stood with us for a time. That was pretty common at home. So I think it is in the values that my parents instilled, where I started understanding the importance of living for something bigger than yourself. And then because I was in Italy, because as I was growing up and I was a teenager, a new phenomenon in southern Italy happened, especially in Palermo, where the social movement against the mafia was assembling and becoming very vocal and active. And that, if you want, was a watershed moment in our own history in Italy, because the law of the mafia is the law of silence. And here, finally, after decades of being under the domination of the mafia, people were organizing and speaking up and denouncing. And there was
suddenly putting sunlight on the whole thing.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And there was this very vocal leader who was a politician and a mayor in Palermo, which in our collective imagination was always the capital of the world capital of the mafia, here denouncing, the linkages between the Christian Democrats and the mafia between politicians and the mafia, which was absolutely something new and absolutely something courageous. And I saw him on TV and I said, I want to work with this guy. And when I finally had a chance to meet him in my hometown, because he came for a lecture, and I interviewed him as I was starting my career in journalism back then, I said, okay, I want to work with you. And I moved to Palermo. And that's really where my journey then started more, actively in this field.
And coming back, just slowing you down a little bit, coming back to your, this larger than life grandfather that you had.
Yeah.
Both of your parents, were they both behind you to follow? Were there messages to follow in his footsteps specifically, or just?
No, yeah, it's very interesting. In my family, we had big debates at home, and if we didn't put the keys in the right place, we could go off for hours and arguing about.
So there was conflict. There was
for these little things. That's why.
Yeah.
But when it came to big ideas, like when I decided to go to Palermo, of course, I was 22. That was the decision of leaving my house. So my parents did ask questions and wanted to make sure that I was, the motivations were there and I had a plan, but it was never questioned in terms of you shouldn't do it. Yeah. This freedom of actually living our lives, that was always very present in my house. So the fundamental questions were, even though my parents maybe wouldn't agree completely that I moved to Palermo and working with this guy, just because I was leaving my hometown and my home. But they would never stop me in any way. In that sense, my parents then, still today, they fully support what I do, and I try to make them as part of my life as possible.
And what's your how do you identify in terms of your nationality? Do you identify as being Italian?
It's interesting because I have traveled and lived now in several places, and I always had I never really definitely Italian, but I'm not only Italian, right? So I never had a sense of how do I define myself until I read the beautiful memoir that Salman Rushdie wrote about the years of where he had to take up another name. And at one point he defines himself as a multi-root person, right? Just because...
Multi-root?
Multi-root, yeah. And I found that for the first time it resonated deeply, because I do think that, so I lived... Not only in Italy, I lived across the country. I lived in.
And Italy is. I mean, I don't know if you even think of it as a country in a way. It's
that's exactly right. So Sicily is very different from my hometown in Dolomites, in the Alps, right? So it's an assemble of countries. So I lived there in 3 or 4 cities. I lived in Germany. I lived in Switzerland. My mother is from Austria, right? I've been now in the United States for 15 years. I lived in Colombia for some times. And where I go, I really, put some roots, right? It becomes really home. I feel like New York today is my home as well, right? But I feel very at home also when I travel to Colombia. So this idea of multi-root is actually something I identify very closely.
So I've noticed, and I don't want to let too much time before I get you talking about a story, but I have noticed recently you, and maybe it's just that I haven't been paying attention, but you seem like you suddenly are way more out there on the internet, your profile, your website, and then I noticed you commenting on Tony Robbins.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm like, okay. So, and you like have one of, it's really interesting. I mean, I think as a using self as instrument, to intervene in complex systems, which of course is kind of the niche of this podcast, essentially. You've kind of decided to, I think you've used the internet as a platform in a sense to do that with the world.
Yeah. You have been paying very close attention and noticing.
Good. Okay, so I got to get right.
Yeah. And it's really, I'm just, first of all, I'm extremely curious, and I always like to see what's out there, what's the next step, and trying to anticipate and just be curious of how the field evolves. And I just noticed in the past few years that internet is becoming an increasingly important platform through which you can reach people, share your stories, and educate people and get educated. So. That's really when in the last few years, I put more attention and tried to, not become an expert, but I did a couple of full immersions in what that means. And I'm trying to apply and modeling people that I see are doing great. But the other shift, I think, that you mentioned in the question that for me has been important. When we train for conflict resolution, we learn a lot of skills that are very important, right? From effective communication to negotiation, to mediation and reframing, all of that. But in my own experience, I realized how important it is actually helping people who are embedded in conflict. And I had really the great fortune of working especially with a lot of perpetrators of violence that getting to an agreement or getting to yes is actually not enough to make a lasting shift, especially if you work with more intractable situation, right? So at one point I just experienced that the tools that conflict resolution is giving me were limited in going deeper in the shift. At least the tools that I had learned and I have been trained with were just too shortcoming in terms of being able to make lasting and more deeper shifts. And for me, again, because I'm curious to see what other people use and what kind of tools they combine. I was preparing a class in conflict resolution at Columbia University, and I was trying to understand what kind of videos are out there on the internet. And I came across this video of Tony Robbins, whom, I heard of, but probably in the back of my mind, he was something like coming from California, too new age, to out there. So probably, not paid really. Not probably. I didn't pay never attention to who he really was and what he was doing, but I saw this video when he did an intervention on 9/11. He was on Hawaii when the World Trade Center came down, and he had this mask.
I know, the story. Yeah, tell it.
And so I saw this intervention because you had basically in these two people the metaphor of the great clash, if you want, that just played out on 9/11. And it's a 2 hours video documentary. It's called Indirect Negotiation, where he uses a variety of great tools, which go from NLP to Ericksonian hypnosis. But, you really...
NLP meaning neurolinguistic programming.
Exactly. And you really, and it's really, that's maybe the tools, but it's really his art and how he does it in a very spontaneous way. And seeing that shift.
Wait, did you say his art or his heart?
No, it's both.
Yeah, okay.
His art, his art is really deep in his heart.
Yeah.
And then I step back and say, okay, if you are able to do this on 9/11, I mean, already facilitating hundreds of people in the room, several from New York on that day, you have to have some skills, some confidence. You have to know what you're doing, because otherwise
tremendous presence,
right? And then seeing the effect, because these two people that he intervened on went on and created a foundation between Israelis and Arabs. So it was a lasting change. So when I saw that, right, then I said, okay, these are the kind of effects, really, this kind of deep changes. That's really why I'm in this field, right? So I wanted to really immerse myself in understanding better the story of Tony Robbins, where he was coming from, what kind of tool he's using, what is his genealogy, right? And that's how I then discovered the field of positive psychology, performance psychology, the whole field of personal development. And I saw that there are tools out there that are very valid, in my opinion, that if I intertwine them and mix them with my training conflict resolution, I might be able, when needed, to serve better the people of the communities that I am. And that has been since my experience. And I've been now writing a blog on psychology today, and that came out from a simple idea. From my own experience, it's not that the tools that I use in the field when I sit down with a perpetrator or a victim, and connecting and building rapport and trying to help are not really different from my everyday interactions. I still have to have effective communication when I interact with my partner at home, with my teachers, with my students, with my colleagues, right, with my friends. So I think there is a lot that from our field we can actually offer in this world that is very complex, on how to navigate this complexity and serving people.
So I may come back to that, but I want to make sure that I get you into a specific situation where, and I don't know if you had mentioned Colombia. Colombia is very dear to my heart. I lived there, but I don't know if that's a story you want to tell.
Sure.
Okay. Because I think
maybe we can just start from the beginning. I mean, how my story started, because it was a very important moment in my career where basically I said, okay, conflict resolution is my thing, right? And at the time, I had just come to the United States. So it was in early 2001. And someone we both know and are friends of, Andrea Bartoli, who is now at Seton Hall College, a dean there. And he was the founder and the director at the time of the Center for International Conflict Resolution. And very generously, he accepted me as part of that community. I think it was some sort of solidarity among Italians who tried to make this.
Although he's just generally a generous person.
He's just great, and absolutely inspiration. And, he really changed my life in that sense from a career point of view. And so as I was started working with him, I was invited to go to Colombia to work with a university, and they asked me to do a workshop in conflict resolution for a community who had been just going through some terrible massacres by death squads. And
what part of Colombia?
It was in a fisher village on the border between Colombia and Panama, so northwest of Colombia. And they had a sustainable development project there, but the fact that it was this massacre had frozen people in terror, and they wanted to work with these 40 community leaders, and they asked me to design a workshop. So
and maybe explain about the massacre. Why did that occur?
So that historically, that is a territory which was a sort of a safe haven for the FARC leftist guerrilla for decades. And then the paramilitary started to expand their domination, their control. And so the terror strategy they had was to go into these villages and basically randomly massacring people because, it was really a terror strategy. So they would get their control of the population right away. And overnight, basically, right?
And it wasn't. I'm asking this because I'm just tracking the strategy around women and rape. Was there a lot of that as well, or was it more just killing people?
For what I knew at the time, in that particular village, it was really just going in and killing people. But definitely the paramilitaries. Certainly also in that village over the time, they absolutely did terrible things and had sexual violence against the women, which is now recognized in Colombia also in the peace process with the FARC actually as a crime against humanity, which is
and as a strategic act of war.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's part of a war strategy, not outside.
Right.
Yeah. So with Andrea's help and others, I prepared very well, for it was my first conflict resolution workshop to be facilitated in Colombia. That was 2001. I didn't speak the language there, so I knew I would have someone translating. So I was very excited because finally I would go in a war zone and do this thing, right? So I prepared lots of notes. I read everything I could read, making notes, designing this thing, and then I brought my stack of notes, and we went to this very small plane, which landed, on an asphalt strip, ending into a soccer field. And I remember, as the plane was coming down, I saw a peasant with a cow in the midst of this landstrip, and I said, well, I thought, my life might be a risk now because of the paramilitaries, but I'm going to die because of this cow. We're just going to hit her. But, everybody knew their drills. And so the peasant at the right moment took the cow out of the way, and we landed safely in the soccer field. Mm-hmm. And it was humid. It was very hot, but I really didn't care because I was there, for a great mission. I was there for this conflict resolution workshop, with this eagerness of the beginning, right? Where you think you have all the tools and all the responses. Even I didn't speak the language. I didn't know much about the.
You speak Spanish, right? You didn't
now
speak
I speak very fluently.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Italian, I think, at this point. But
yeah.
At the time, no, I was just beginning my adventure there. And so I finally go and I sit down with this colleague who was teaching at a university in Medellin. He was an Austrian, really nice, funny, round guy. And so I put all these stacks of notes on the table, and I started telling him what I want to do here and there. And then he stops me and says, "No, you cannot do this. You cannot talk about conflict resolution here, right? You cannot bring up the massacres. You cannot talk about peace because all sensitive language. We really don't know who belongs to whom among these leaders, right? So we need to remain very neutral, right?" And I ran into a sort of a panic because, everything I had prepared, I could just throw it into the ocean, into the water, right? It was absolutely not useful whatsoever. And that was a Friday evening, and on Saturday.
So interesting. I'm thinking about it. Of course, what's coming to mind. I don't know if you know Brene Brown. She's done a lot of writing on vulnerability. That's she's been one of the foremost head talk. But I remember her telling her one of her stories is she wasn't allowed. She was told she started to talk. She wasn't allowed to use the word vulnerability. And she's like, "Oh, well, that's interesting. How am I supposed to proceed?" Yeah. And here you are. You're not supposed to talk about the elephant in the room. You're supposed
and actually,
to.
One of the thoughts I had was, wow, if we cannot even talk about peace, how bad is the situation?
And why do you think that? What? I don't quite get it. So
at the time, I was not that familiar with the dynamics, but thinking back, I think that because of the paramilitary's presence there, so extreme right wing, the peace language, conflict resolution, peace and peace building, was attributed more historically to the left and to more.
So it made you look like you were not neutral.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
It make me feel more closer to the communities, which would not have put myself at risk and jeopardy, really,
Yeah.
but more the people who invited me, the
Gotcha.
leaders who, right?
Gotcha.
On
Okay,
one hand.
yeah.
Secondly,
Yeah.
regardless, which is very important in the use of language that we do when we do this work, it would have not served the purpose of these people, right? Might have been attached very much about my meaning of peace, but it wouldn't resonate with the experience in their meaning. So it would
Why
have.
and why? Can you say why? Can you say a bit more?
Yeah,
about
exactly.
that?
So if when I say peace, instead of thinking of something beautiful that we want to create together, it reminds me of the dynamic of war. Well, using peace is actually not serving the purpose of me being there, which was instead facilitating, maybe not talking about peace, but facilitating an experience of peace, right? And that for me was important as a lesson learned, that you use the language that you need to use in order to facilitate the opening of a certain space where a certain experience is possible.
Kind of like you were getting ahead of yourself with that.
I was bringing myself. I was bringing my model of the world, my map, and imposing it, right?
Yeah.
So this was Friday night, and on Saturday morning we would have this workshop, and I had nothing because everything I had prepared was just not possible. So I took a stroll on the beach.
May the force be with you, Luke Skywalker.
In fact, I looked up to the horizon, very beautiful Caribbean scene, and said, "Please, some ideas come from there because now I have, they for them it was a big deal. Someone coming from New York, from Columbia University, being there, and now I thought I'm gonna let everybody down, starting with my friend Andrea Bartoli, because I have nothing in my hand. So I was panicking a little bit, and at one point I saw two children. And they looked like fighting the water. They were throwing each other in the water. And I was almost jumping to intervene and, to be the peacemaker there and separate them. And as I was almost jumping towards them, I realized they got up and they embraced themselves. They started laughing. They shook their hands and we were playing. They were, right? And I said, oh, wow, interesting. Maybe, I said, maybe I don't have to intervene all the time, right? Maybe intervening is not always the best. Maybe you have just to step back sometimes and let people play it out, right?
I don't know if you know Marv Weisbord and Sandra Janoff's, one of the best books I've ever read on facilitation called Don't Just Do Something, Stand There.
Oh, yeah.
But, that notion, I think a lot of us can over-intervene, just like doctors can over-intervene.
Yes.
And it's sometimes the subtlety of one's presence in the system that I think can make the most profound difference. But anyway, I'm interjecting. I want to,
but it's very poignant because I understood in that moment. I understood that conflict resolution is both about holding on and letting go. Right. In that moment, I had to let go of everything that I had prepared and hold on more on connecting with the true intention why I was there. I was not there to intervene to serve the world. I was there to serve whatever circumstances, right? And when I did that check, which just, with that connection with myself that happened while I was looking at those two boys playing around with themselves, I just realized that that's really the whole thing that I needed to do was to connect with my purpose and explore in a certain curiosity. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, right? But not saying it's...
Yeah, my one of my biggest teachers, John Carter, who's at the Gestalt Institute of Cleveland, he always said, if you know your intent, you'll know your intervention. Yeah. You just have to get really clear about your intent.
And that opened up, instead of being closed and stressed and anxious and preoccupied, it became an exploration, became a matter of curiosity. Oh, I don't know actually tomorrow what will come out. Well, that's somehow funny, right? The only idea that came to myself and was something that I had wrote in my notes was that storytelling is cathartic. That was somehow a principle. So as I was walking back to the village, I thought, well, why don't tomorrow we don't do a workshop where we rebuild the collective memory of the village, right?
Wow.
And I said, so instead of asking me about the massacres or asking questions, let the conversation emerge. Right, and that's really what I did. So the next day,
sounds very brilliant.
Yeah, so
really
on this intuition, I had these 40 leaders around me, right? And with translation, I explained, let's do this exercise today. Let's just reconstruct the collective memory of this village. Think about what your grandparents and grandparents told you. Think about the story you heard from your parents and from your neighbors, and think about the stories that you live directly. Secretly, I was hoping maybe someone will also talk about the massacres, and we take it from there.
I mean, dangerous. I mean, not but there you are opening up. You're in. The invitation has got to be in the collective memory. So I don't. Yeah.
So I put it out there, right? And I said, now you have like 20 minutes to jot down your notes, to think about it, and then we share them, right? And it was beautiful when, they took it very seriously. They were writing down, there was this silence, just births and the humidity. It was,
I'm sorry, although the people in the room, there were 40, and they were multiple stakeholder groups represented. They were
groups, it was women, it was men, it was elderly, it was young people, different, people who had small restaurants, people who were fishers, people who had just immigrated there more recently, people who have been there the entire life. It was really representative of a society that was there in this small village that might have had maybe 400 or 500 people living there, right? So it was like 10%, if you want, of the village was there. And so we did this exercise, and it was beautiful. It was sacred. And then we started, sharing. And I had a board where I with a friend of mine would just, write down whatever they said. And I remember the first woman who stood up shared the story of when the first mirror arrived to the village, and how her experience the first time seeing her face reflecting in a mirror and not in the water. And that sparked a whole interesting conversation because, especially the younger generation didn't know them. So, we made up the story of this, mirror, where it came from, who brought it, and all of that. And that set somehow a nice atmosphere. And then it was right after it was another woman who stood up and remembered the night when the paramilitaries penetrated the village and, killed her husband, and how she was hiding under the bed. And it was, very strong. And everybody actually connected with her. And I think the important experience they made at that moment was that all of them had that trauma. All of them went through that pain. But until that moment, it remained somehow private. It didn't feel safe to share the mourning, the terror, the fear that they had going through. And they discovered that was actually a shared common experience. And of course, there were tears, and other people started sharing that story. But because we had created that safe space, it was not. It was transcending that reality by putting it together. It was really rebuilding the links of the community after they were frozen by what had happened.
And it's tricky business. It's it's just listening. It's Black History Month here. I guess you. And Maya Angelou, apparently she was raped as a 7-year-old and then didn't speak for 5 years. And, getting people to start speaking about trauma is tricky because, I tend to lean into it and let it happen, not force people, but open it up. But you also don't want to re-traumatize people, too. Or so you're dealing with. You must have been dealing with a huge amount of trauma in that room. Yeah.
At the same time, because they knew each other, there was a history of being a community. It's not that these people were coming there for the first time. Because, they were there actually with an intent, right? They came because they wanted to do actually an exercise. They didn't know exactly what it was about, but they had actually chosen to be there and to contribute. And because
and why was that? And I still was wondering, how they came to be in the room.
It was invited. It was part of this series of workshops and trainings that the university had set up for this sustainable development project. Right. So it was a participatory process. Right.
Yeah.
It's not the first of the workshops. There was already a little bit of a history there, and because basically the stories we elicited. So I think this woman felt free. Or wanted to free herself somehow from this story that she was bearing inside herself. And for sure, everybody knew about this story because everybody knew that her husband was killed. They might not have known somehow the details or how she lived that story, right? But that created connections. And I think they felt the space was safe, right? And and we just let it go. There was certainly no intervention on my behalf. There was no questions or wanted to know more. Whatever someone wanted to say, it would be said, and that was it. And if they started a conversation, that was fine. But there was a lot of respect and a lot of empathy among all of them. And that, changed completely the atmosphere. It connects them again, and made them feel we are all in this together. And they started being very creative about what they actually need in this village to move forward, right? I remember we wanted to build a new room in a school where some internet and computer can be put. They were thinking of a health center. So it became very creative at the end. And I remember, the last moment of this workshop on Sunday night, I just asked them to share, the experience. What was it, these 2 days of working together? And we wanted to record it, and I didn't know if that was safe for them and recording. So I just said, if you don't mind, if you will, we can record it. If you don't, we don't have to, really. But I was impressed how everybody was actually holding on to that recorder and making sure that their testimony and their voice was going to be recorded, which for me was really impressive, right?
Yeah.
And I always remember this old elderly, probably the eldest among the group, Fisher man, who stood up with this recorder in the hand and said to everybody, I want to actually go and talk to the leaders of the guerrilla and talk to the leaders of the paramilitary, explain to them what we did in these 2 days, and I'm ready to give my life for that, right? And I had this sense of this older prophet somehow who had seen the promised land of peace and was so taken by the experience and understood that was so important that, he wanted to make sure that this dynamic that had started that weekend could continue. And so for me, it was a great lesson because it didn't really matter everything I had prepared, though probably it mattered in the sense that it put me in a certain state, right? And so I arrived with a desire to serve, but I eventually had to throw that out of, not holding on that, holding on only on the purpose and just going with the flow, going with the dynamic, staying and mirroring and matching what was happening at the time. And I was really blown away. I remember when I went back and I told Andrea about it, I say, I'm amazed at how a couple of tools, really simple tools, can really help people to find in themselves, to discover in themselves that strength and that courage that is needed to move on, and how it is possible to create a space of peace even in the midst of the worst violence.
So, it sounds like one of the tools, I wonder how you would list the tools, but it sounded like one of them was giving people space to tell their stories.
Yes.
Actually, what would you say were the simple tools that were key?
I think the first tool was, for myself, the first tool was self-awareness. Really understanding what was going on, really understanding where that source of anxiety was coming from when I freaked out because I didn't have anything to offer at a certain point, and realizing that was not really serving myself and anybody else. And realizing that helped me to do the shift and be present in a different way, more with the purpose rather than with the eagerness of being this conflict resolution expert who lands in the jungle, right? Which, so less of an Indiana Jones and more at service, right? So I think that shift was very important, and it's something that remained with me for the rest of now 15 years that I've been working in Colombia. The second one is exactly what you do, what you said, is that listening opens up the space of trust, of connection, right? So it's not what you say, it's not principles, it's not whatever you can teach. It's really listening with an authentic and deep intent and staying with what you're listening. Not moving forward, not manipulating, not anticipating, but really staying with whatever people are saying. I think it's very important to open that space, and it opens up, conversation that you cannot imagine or foresee.
Yeah, it's reminding me of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. It's reminding me of the language you use in your bio of, I can't remember it now and it's not in front of me exactly, but getting people, rather than focusing on who is right and who is wrong.
Listen to their stories.
Listening to their stories and leaning into their stories, and getting them interested in each other's stories.
Yeah.
And I wanted to, something else you said about bonding, and you referred to it earlier about bonding with, I was just actually interviewing Mel Duncan, who works with Nonviolent Peace Force, and I don't know if you know them, but they are going into the center of the most deadly conflicts as neutrals, and of course they have to really be neutrals. Yeah. And you spoke to that as well, as how do you bond with the perpetrators as opposed to the victims? Yeah. How do you maintain neutrality with, the thing that's interesting about perpetrator and victim gets into, we could have conversations about, so much to be said about that, both at the high group level and at, the small group level. Yeah. Because of course, many times you'll see people, perpetrating from the victim position. There's a lot of that goes on. And anyway, so how in your experience have you been able to bond with the perpetrators? Because you've dealt with some pretty horrendous, quote unquote, perpetrators.
Yeah. So, first of all, it goes back a little bit to what I was saying in the beginning. I'm extremely curious, and I really want to find out what brought you to the point where we meet, and what's your story? How did you get to the point where we are meeting, and what are the key decisions that you made along the way, right? So I never think, when I meet someone, I never think of them. I never put a label. You're a perpetrator. You're a victim. And actually, in my work, what I discover is that I would say, if I just think of the stories that I listen to, and I listen to hundreds of perpetrators, I would say 90% were victim first and perpetrators later. So it's a hybrid identity most of the time. But again, the easiest way has been for me always to listen.
And actually, do you make any meaning of that? Do you make up stuff about why that is?
Why it is that they are both?
Yeah, that they started as victims and then became perpetrators.
Well, I think it varies a little bit, but I would say that sometimes the people who then become also perpetrators think that that's the best decision they make given the information and the knowledge they have at the moment. Sometimes it's the only way they have to feel useful, to feel someone that they're actually reacting to a situation in a certain way, that they become someone, right? A lot of them, the great majority I met are men, and for many it has to do with the dimension of masculinity, and career.
I guess doesn't Tony Robbins refer to it as the need for significance?
The need for significance, absolutely, right? And we all have that, and they just find out that that's the best strategy they can have to be someone, right? So sometimes it's also very circumstantial. I remember this paramilitary guy who became a major guy. He was just telling me that he had lost both his grandparents, who was very attached. He was 13 years old, out in the countryside, not much going on, no affection anymore. He had been abandoned by his mom, and a paramilitary group came across the land where he was living and offered him to join. And of course, for him, that was at that moment the best decision he could make. Would have been the guerrillas coming through or the military coming through, he would have joined them, right? There's no ideological really reason. It was just the best strategy at the moment to get out of a situation.
And to feel like he belonged to something.
To someone, right? So it's a lot of that going on.
Yeah.
But so connecting, I found it always, people ask me a lot, and sometimes I just put out a book which is called The Parastate, where I tell the stories of these members of the paramilitaries I met in my ethnographic work. And a lot of people tell me, how do you meet these people? How do you make them tell their stories? The truth is that for them, it's such a unique experience to have someone who is genuinely interested in their story, that just the fact that you sit down and listen for them is completely new. as a story. So we are always happy to talk about ourselves, as is obvious in this ourself conversation, right? And so do they too, right? So I never found it very, very, very difficult. What I found it very interesting is something that I learned from anti-mafia prosecutor in Palermo, who was then killed by the mafia, Pablo Borsellino. He always said that when he was, he's one of the first one who was able to have members of the mafia opening up and revealing their secrets from within the Cosa Nostra, right? Which allowed, it was a watershed moment in the persecution of the mafia in Sicily. And he always said that he felt the responsibility when he met with these people, he felt the responsibility of, and he felt like being the best representative of society, of a civil society, and to really embody those values that come with being a prosecutor, right? Because he wanted to show them a different world, and he felt the responsibility somehow to represent a different value system. And that for me has always been in the back of my mind, being really authentic when I meet them. And it really becomes a dialogue, because it is a dialogue between two people with two completely stories. And the same way I'm curious about their stories, they become curious about my own stories. And that's when the most interesting conversation start. And I remember as I was interviewing a pretty, bloodthirsty paramilitary at one point, and he was very graphic, I really wanted to leave the room, and I got to a moment where I was despising even being there and having to listen to that. But just at one point, as I was listening to him, I just understood that reaction was coming from me putting myself on a higher moral pedestal, and not because I had any sympathy with what he did, but I was judging him from my pretty comfortable life, right? And when I had that thought, I understood that in his, if I put myself in my shoes and I had those elements and those moments and that knowledge to make the decision I had to make, maybe I would have made the same choices that he made. And I realized that capacity for rage, that capacity for violence, was also in me. I have, just because of my human condition, I never was put in a situation where I had to exercise it. I was always put in check that part, right?
I think that's a beautiful thing you just said. And I think it's beautiful for all of us to be recognizing
and that for me took away moral judgment of these people, and I always was able to meet them as person. Never, and I always told them that I don't agree. I mean, I'm pretty honest with, respectful but honest with them. But let me tell you a small experience I had. I enjoy it, don't share it publicly, so I give you that. I tell my students, but not publicly. But after a few years, I was, you become part of a landscape when you do your part in that. You absorb a lot, right? And so also your mind starts thinking and acting as people do in those situations. And after a few years I was there, at one point, I just got the news from someone who was in touch with prison and so on, that a particular paramilitary guy who I had interviewed and even helped was planning to kidnap me, right? And when I heard that, my first instinct was not,
what would be his purpose?
No, I was not asking those questions. And I was also not saying, I need to call the police and protect myself. My first instinct and reaction was, we have to kill the guy, right? And then I was even scared of my own thought, but I realized I became part of that landscape, right? I was there, and I knew that actually in that condition, going to the police was serving no purpose, because that's what it is. And then, of course, I was able to step back and think about it, and being very interested that I had actually that instinct I had been listening to all the time. So that capacity actually was in me. So only that, thank God, then my history, my story, and everything else made me realize that was just a reflection, an instinctive moment, and never became a plan, right? So I shared that then with another paramilitary guy. And I told him, this happened to me, so-and-so. I heard that. So, by the way, I don't even know if it's true. It was a rumor, but a rumor kills in a context of conflict, right? So I was really became part of the landscape in that sense too. And I told him, so and so, I heard this, and so happened, and it was really nice because this guy wanted to show me his friendship and say, but at least I can go and have him beat him up, right? And I said, no, I mean, thank you, I really appreciate it. He really wanted to offer, to do, right? I say, well, and it started a beautiful conversation because I say, we really have to stop this chain of violence, right? And I said, I have a chance here, right? Actually. Not to react with violence to, if it's true that he wants to kidnap me, which is another act of violence, right? And we started this beautiful conversation about, stopping that reactive chain of.
I always, my Gestalt training is such that, when you're intervening in a complex system, you always have to bring something to the system that the system's not doing for itself.
Yeah.
But then you have to be really careful about, become part of the landscape or becoming confluent with the system.
Sure.
So you're not offering anything anymore.
Yeah.
You're just becoming sort of sucked in.
Yeah.
And it's a very delicate dance, I think,
this is why I think it's very important, if you do fieldwork research, as I was doing in that time, or if you do conflict resolution work, that you actually leave the field, often just to, refresh yourself and clean yourself, if you want, from also the negativity that you necessarily pick up when you hear all those stories, right?
Right.
Otherwise,
and the fear. I mean, I'm sure for you, the fear of when you hear that you're going to get kidnapped, it's terrifying.
Yeah, it's serious, right? And you don't care really if it's a rumor. You don't have a luxury to think, is it a rumor, is it a fact? Because the only way to verify is that letting it happen. So you try not to have that happen, right?
So, although, as I said, the time goes by quickly, and the time is going by quickly, and I wanted to ask you, somebody who's really very deeply immersed in the peace building, conflict resolution field, what are your hopes for where this is heading? What's your best case scenario for what we can do with this field and the kind of difference we can make?
This is a very important question, I think, because if we are looking what is happening outside in the world, right, with ISIS and all of that, there seems to be less and less opportunity to have traditional ways of doing conflict resolution, right? We might see less and less negotiation tables or formal peace talks. So I think this is a very challenging time also for those of us who are, not only doing this kind of work, but trying to live according to those principles. For our field, I think a new space where we can contribute, and that is very important also for everything that is happening, are urban areas. By 2030, according to the United Nations, we will have 80% of the population living in town. So the new theater of conflict, where conflicts are playing out, will be our cities, right? And not just in terms of violence, but in terms of every kind of challenges, from immigration to viruses. We see now what is happening with this new virus in Latin America. Climate change and also the violence, the transnational networks of crime is really going to play out in the cities, and that's where we are going to be affected. And I think we need to capacitate our communities, our urban communities, to live according to the principle and the strategies and the tools of conflict resolution, to do strategic community building as a response to the senseless, sometimes violence that comes out, and interrupting, learning to interrupt that chain of reactions that is only increasing violence instead of interrupting. I think we need to interrupt history somehow. Maybe I can finish with this. When Paris happened a few months ago, I always feel when those things happen, for a moment, I really feel overwhelmed, because you say, no, first of all, you realize this stays for a while. This is the kind of experience we will have. We have to face that. And how do we confront this? How do we respond to that? And it's easy if you are a leader, a politician, to say, we take our war to ISIS and all of that. But you are actually speaking from the same space. You are just reinforcing that narrative.
You're part of the landscape.
You're part of the landscape, right? Even if you think you're more legitimate now because you have been elected, you're a state representative. Truth is, you are playing within the same model of the world. And as I was thinking of that, I saw this young German pianist who put his piano on a track and traveled the whole night from Germany to Paris and opened up his piano and played Image from John Lennon before the theater, right? And people were assembling. And I said, wow, that's a completely different response, right?
I just want to make sure people heard what you said, that he played the song Imagine by John Lennon on his piano.
Right?
Yeah, beautiful.
And that was his way. Then I discovered actually that he does that and goes to all these places of tension around the world and shows up with his piano and plays, right? And
what a beautiful thing.
It's a wonderful response, right? Because it's the same event, but completely different response. He's actually not perpetuating the same narrative. He's actually interrupting it. Now, we might think that the president of a country is more powerful than a pianist, right? But I think we should think about more about the pianist, understand what he really did. And if we understand that and we live it and we multiply it, then I'm sure we have a critical mass enough to at least contain, if reduce and maybe transform the dynamics that are still creating violence in our world.
I think what you're saying also speaks to something that's that I'm thinking a lot about these days, which is the power of that leadership. The era of heroic leadership is kind of over. To think that one person can do something or top of the system can do something is just not really enough because of the complexity. But to have people understand that everybody has the capacity to do something that's meaningful, and that pianist, I mean, that can be, I'm sure, is a super profound thing that he.
And by the way, the world still is out there, and we are still alive, and we are still doing things because the majority of us are responding to those acts of violence in a completely way. We are just don't recognize how much our, if we have a compounding effect of our daily peace things, they don't reach the headlines. But actually, if ISIS would be the only reality, we wouldn't have the world at this point, right? And so violence and terrorism is not the only dynamic. It's actually a very small dynamic going on. The majority is that a lot of us every day do their duties with dedication, as parents, as lovers, as teachers, as whoever in our professions. And that's why the world goes ahead and is actually, a good place to be. We just have to be more aware of this peace capacity that we have every day, and we are living it without maybe calling it peace building. But that's actually what we do, because otherwise we wouldn't have our planet.
And I just want to end with because I know, like, on the one hand, you go and you speak to the U.S. Congress about strategies in terms of best strategies for resolving conflict, but you also have a blog that really speaks to each of us as human beings and what we can do. So I think if anybody's listening and wants to know, get some daily. I don't know if it's daily.
No, it's weekly. The blog I put.
Okay.
Yeah. It's weekly.
Okay, but it really takes it right down to the personal level and what each of us can do to be conflict resolvers, to be leaders, to be better negotiators, to bring a more peaceful world. So anyway, anything else you want to say as we sign off, Aldo?
A big thank you, Susan, to you for it was a wonderful conversation, for all of those who have listened to us. And one place where we can meet again is my blog and my website. And I hope we can continue this conversation also offline with you, Susan.
Beautiful. Thank you very much for the work you're doing in the world. I think it's, obviously much appreciated and needed. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode of the Peace Building Podcast. Check out the peacebuildingpodcast.com for show notes and for more great information and resources. We like your feedback, comments, and suggestions. Please email them to Susan at thepeacebuildingpodcast.com. And join us again for next week's episode for more great thinking, innovations, and ideas to take our planet to the next level.